The United States top diplomat Antony Blinken is on his latest official trip to the African continent as he becomes the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit Niger Republic. His historic visit comes as the West African country emerges as an increasingly significant partner to the U.S. and its European allies in the Sahel region. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Wednesday urged Ethiopia to ensure accountability over the brutal Tigray conflict, but was optimistic of the enthronement of peace on a trip that eases a wartime rift between the longtime allies. The top U.S. diplomat said greater economic relations with Ethiopia depended on its commitment to both reconciliation and accountability over the war, which the United States estimates has cost about 500,000 lives. Blinken also met with representatives of the Tigray People's Liberation Front and said that both sides indicated commitment to implementing the November 2nd peace accord brokered in South Africa by the African Union, with the United States in support. Now, for more on the visit of the U.S. Secretary of State to Africa, President Emeritus Corporate Council on Africa, Stephen Hayes, joins us now from the U.S. Good to have you join us.
Thank you, and good morning to you.
So let's look. It does seem like we're seeing increased activity of the U.S. in Africa. For example, it was in November 2021, we had Antony Blinken as well in Africa. Particularly, he came to Nigeria. And then just last December, there was a U.S.-Africa summit held by President Biden. And now Antony Blinken is back again in Africa. Why are we seeing this increased engagement of the U.S. In the African continent?
Well, I think it's clearly security concerns right now. I think that's one of the highest priorities in Africa, and certainly it's one of the highest priorities in Nigeria. It's been important in Ethiopia and Niger. So he's hit the three countries right now that I think are absolutely key to reducing the level of terrorism. Niger plays the central role, really, in the Sahel. Nigeria is critical not simply to the West Africa region, but also throughout Africa. And Ethiopia is critical to the Horn of Africa as well as to the Middle East. So those are the three nations that I think should be the priorities right now, if our priority is security. And I think that the selection of the countries clearly shows that that's the priority.
The U.S. is coming at a time where there is a power shift in the Sahel. We know that we've seen military coups in Mali, in Guinea, and Burkina Faso, and some other African countries. France has a strong presence as well in some parts of the Sahel. There is also the presence of the Wagner mercenary as well. So how is the U.S. late for the party, and how does the U.S. begin to navigate through these power dynamics in the Sahel?
Well, I think somewhat belatedly that is the purpose of the trip, but particularly as regards Niger, is how does the U.S. become more effective as a partner in Niger? France has withdrawn to some extent, and the Wagner Group has filled that vacuum, which I think is somewhat disturbing. You understand why countries want some help from outside, but at the same time, the Wagner Group has also been engaged in mining and also brutality, taking the resources and so forth. So I think that the United States needs to play a stronger role, and clearly Secretary Blinken and President Biden feel that as well.
Happening at a time where there is a level of distrust in the continent for France and some European countries, and just generally the presence of the West in Africa. How easy will this be for the U.S.?
Well, I don't think it's ever been really easy. I think that one of the dangers is slipping back into the Cold War mentality, which I think would be very bad for Africa. I don't think it would be great for the world either, frankly, but I think it's going to be very difficult. The United States has its own split, as you know well, and I think that to develop consensus on Africa is going to be difficult within Congress. But I'm hopeful in that regard. I think also that within government there is a competition sense of USAID has been assigned the leadership of President Biden's Africa leadership, but State Department now is taking a stronger role, which I think is good to see. And you still have the Defense Department also as a partner, is also in somewhat at a certain level as competitor. I think the Biden administration or any administration will quickly say that everybody's happy and working together, but I don't think that's necessarily the case, and I think it's probably the case with most governments. But to answer your question, I think it's going to be difficult. It's not insurmountable. I think the United States needs to move faster than it has, but history is what it is, and I think the U.S. now needs to have a much stronger and certainly a much coordinated policy. And when I say coordinated, I think it also needs to be coordinated with the African Union much more closely. We just can't operate in a vacuum, and we can't operate and with arrogance as well. I think that the closer we work with African partners, the better off everyone's going to be.
Vacuum. It's not just in Africa. Just yesterday, there was a report about Honduras normalizing or formalizing ties with China, and that perhaps would have great impact on Taiwan. And it does seem that China is also having a very strong presence in Latin America, and just as well as Africa. Do you think that when it comes to foreign policy and that influence in some regions and continents of the world, that it does seem like the U.S. is playing catch up?
Well, I think clearly the United States is playing catch up. We've assumed far too much. There has been, I think, a certain degree of arrogance that has proven to be unwarranted, and I think that the U.S. needs to look introspectively as well. And I think that's beginning to happen, but not quite as fast as I think it should. And I certainly we're playing catch up. Central America is an interesting place. I don't say that, and I think every nation has a right to engage with other nations. So I'm not critical of China's engagement. I think that the United States could be doing much more, and I think that we still ought to open the dialogue much more strongly with China if possible, because I think the world's in great peril right now.
Visit to Niger. Niger borders Mali and Burkina Faso, where there's a heavy presence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates who are jockeying for power through violence. How critical is this visit for the U.S. to Niger?
Well, I think it's critical because I don't anticipate a Secretary of State coming back to Niger in the near future. In fact, this is the first visit by a U.S. Secretary of State ever to Niger. So a lot of issues have to be addressed during this visit in a very short time. And I think that also then the infrastructure for cooperation has to be laid with this visit, and certainly a follow-up presence. Niger also has played a critical role for the U.S. It's been the base for a lot of its operations of support for Sahel in Niger. So it's very critical. It's going to take some time and follow up, and how that follow up takes place is going to be essential.
Antony Blinken also met with the Tigray Liberation Front in Ethiopia. What sort of impact can the U.S. make on that conflict?
Well, I think the U.S. has a very critical role to play. I think it was initially perceived, and I'm not sure that it was wrongly perceived, as being TPLF favored, but I think that they've come around to recognize that the Ethiopian government itself needs support, and it needs a partnership with the United States. And the United States, frankly, needs Ethiopia just as much. So I think that the TPLF should disband, frankly, new leadership, and there's persons within the TPLF that feel the same way. That the conflict in Ethiopia now at least has a peace agreement that looks like both sides are, for the time being, committed committed to making this work. But also there's going to have to be a greater U.S. Involvement with the Ethiopian government. To me, that means returning to eliminating the AGOA sanctions, because the AGOA has been very critical and very important to Ethiopia, perhaps more than most countries in Africa. So I think the sooner that is put into place, which provides jobs for hundreds of thousands of people in Ethiopia, if not millions, and that's going to help the U.S. relationship. And so I think that there's also within the U.S. government and the non-governmental community a debate as to how soon that could happen. Is my understanding that the State Department wants that to happen sooner than later, as I think it should. But there are conflicting pressures, both within Ethiopia, between, again, the TPLF and Ethiopia itself, although I think that's reducing, and within the NGO community and the government. But I think the sooner that we can reinstate AGOA for Ethiopia, the better the situation is going to become.
Well, some people will wonder the impact the U.S. will have now in Africa, where in some cases the U.S. has denied some African countries who are fighting against insurgency or fighting insurgents weapons, sale of weapons. And one wonders, how the U.S. would navigate through all of that. But thank you so much for talking to us. The President Emeritus, Corporate Council on Africa, Stephen Hayes.
Thank you. It's an honor as usual.